Well, good morning, everybody. It's Monday, April 20th, and welcome to Coffee with Ken. I'm Ken Biberaj, Managing Director with Savills, a leading tenant advisory commercial real estate firm. We are beginning week 6 of social distancing as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. The White House and Congress are nearing a deal for an additional aid package to small businesses in the range of $450 billion, which also includes funding for hospitals and testing. Today's topic is whether public health should be part of the national security calculus. And our special guest is Michele Flournoy, the co-founder of WestExec Advisors and former U.S. Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Good to see you, Michele.
Good to see you, Ken.
I am at our virtual Swings Coffee Shop on 14th and G, just down the street from your office. So I look forward to the day we can be back in person, enjoying a cup of coffee.
Indeed.
Well, listen, I figure we just jump right in. You've talked a little bit about this previously. Why and how should public health be part of the national security calculus?
Well, I think after this experience of the pandemic, which has touched almost every American in some way, I think it's going to be a political imperative for whoever the next president is to treat pandemic prevention and response as a national security issue. It should be an expectation that Americans feel that their public health is taken care of as part of their security. And I think that has implications in a number of ways. One, it needs to be part of our national security strategy and our bandwidth and thinking. I think it's very important that we plan and exercise for pandemics in the future to make sure we're prepared, and that senior leaders understand the kinds of decisions they'll have to make early to deal with it effectively. It has an implication for how we spend. We've allowed our public health infrastructure to atrophy. We're seeing that right now, where as we try to reopen the economy and we need to move towards a system of far greater testing, we also need public health personnel to be able to trace contacts and so forth to keep the virus in check as we reopen. And so I think, and then lastly, I would say in terms of supply chains, we're very dependent on PPE from China, other goods and from overseas. I think there's going to be demand to re-examine aspects of our supply chain, and sort of like we treat defense articles, think a little bit more about pharma, medical supplies, PPE as a national security issue.
So it strikes me, obviously, with the pandemic is borders don't matter. You could be on the Theodore Roosevelt and Corona can find you. You spend a lot of time, obviously, at DoD doing policy planning. How do you think about the global institutions and the role they play in terms of addressing a pandemic like this on a global basis, right? It's not just us and our military. This is really, how does that all play? How does it all work? And which institutions are not being tapped, maybe?
Yeah, I think this administration has missed an opportunity, dropped the ball on that, frankly. Lisa Monaco and I wrote a piece saying that this has not been a great moment for U.S. global leadership. In fact, the perception of U.S. global leadership may become a casualty of this crisis. In the past, whether it was the Bush administration dealing with the AIDS pandemic, the Bush and Obama administrations dealing with the financial crisis, or Obama dealing with Ebola, in each case, you had the President of the United States going to the G7, the G20, using global groups to consult with allies, galvanize international support, orchestrate a more effective international response, even as we dealt with issues at home. And the U.S. has not, this administration has not taken that tack. And as a result, we have not had as an effective international response, and particularly in the developing world, where this is going to hit next with very, very severe, I would say, dire consequences.
So when we look at our response, I mean, we're all really focused on Dr. Fauci and CDC and FDA and Health and Human Services. But I think one of the underlying aspects of the response that's kind of surprised a lot of people is the role of the Department of Defense in something like this. Can you talk about what role DoD plays in the response, and obviously maybe even clarify some terminology, like when we hear stockpile, what does that mean, and who controls that and these kinds of things?
So there are things that the DoD doesn't control, but people think of in defense terms. The Defense Production Act is an act that gives the president the authority to redirect production capacity to produce emergency supplies.
Mhm.
That was eventually used, but not used early enough, in my view, or as aggressively as it might have been. But it's not really a DoD issue. I think the DoD's role is more in providing additional engineering capacity. If the Army Corps of Engineers has been helping to turn convention centers around the country into additional
Yeah.
hospital beds, providing hospital ships when that's appropriate, providing logistics support through either State National Guard or other units, and providing additional medical capacity as well. The national stockpile is actually not a DoD stockpile. That is under, I believe it's under FEMA's control. But one of the things we've learned is we've always created stockpiles on the assumption that one region or locality will have a problem, and then we surge everything from across the country to that one location. When you have a national crisis like this, those stockpiles are very quickly overwhelmed. So that's another thing that will need to be reconceived coming out of this crisis.
So dive in a little bit more on the Defense Production Act. Like, how has it been used so far? How has the Trump administration used it? How do you think it could have or should have been used earlier on, and so on?
So the administration was very reluctant initially to use the authority. They felt they had ad hoc sort of voluntary cooperation from companies, and that's great. But what we've learned is, the old adage, "He who hesitates is lost." When it's very difficult to overreact in a crisis like this. You pay the price when you underreact or you're too delayed in your decision making. And so we finally, in March, the president did use the act to increase the use of the production of things like ventilators, some as parts of PPE and so forth. But as a result, most of that surge isn't going to hit hospitals until the summer, as opposed to now. And so I think that is a lesson learned.
Mhm. So obviously, just because there's a pandemic doesn't mean that threats against the United States and elsewhere and interests stop, right? So how do you assess the world today? Where are we vulnerable? Where do we need to continue to pay close attention, even though we are so obviously focused on the pandemic's impact domestically?
Yeah, whenever the U.S. is internally focused, it sort of creates an opportunity for mischief on the part of some of our rivals or potential adversaries. Right now, I think the main place I've seen it in to a small degree is in the South China Sea. We've had, the Chinese Coast Guard sink a Vietnamese fishing vessel in disputed areas. You've just had China come out with naming and 80 some land features in the South China Sea, claiming them again beyond what international law would recognize. And so there's some of that going on. But Iran has been very preoccupied. We've seen North Korea take some short-range missile launches during this period. So it's just an important time to be vigilant. But it's also a time where some of our military readiness might be challenged if it's not carefully managed. We've seen what's happened with Theodore Roosevelt. I think the Navy and the other services are obviously very concerned about the health of their people, but also taking pains to make sure we have forces at the ready for any kind of crisis response or deterrence.
So you mentioned China. How does the global chessboard change after COVID-19? I mean, are we going to see greater prominence from China, less prominence because of maybe a backlash associated with, maybe a bit of blame, Russia? How do you see things playing out in the next, 6 to 12 months?
Yeah, well, I think we're certainly going to see even, more tense U.S.-China relations. I think the Chinese leadership right now is in a very concerned position. Obviously, the virus came out of China, whether it was a wet market or a lab, we don't know, but it came from China. Their early response was not transparent, did not share data, did not share accurate data, and contributed to a worse global crisis as a result of that. Some of their initial PPE diplomacy, sending supplies around the world, where normally that should be welcomed. In this case, many of those were defective, or they came with pretty draconian strings attached for smaller countries. And so they've had both domestic backlash against the suppression of the early voices calling out this crisis, and international criticism for some of the way they've handled themselves, trying to change the narrative, shift blame. So I think, they're going to struggle with this. And their economy, oh, by the way, has shrunk for the first time in decades. So they have a lot on their plate. But, on our side, we are entering an election season, and we've already seen ads on both sides trying to make the China issue a weapon politically in our own politics. And that's of concern. I am concerned that this administration continues to take a very tactical, inconsistent, transactional approach to China. I think we need a much more strategic approach that focuses on investing in the drivers of our own competitiveness here at home, economically, technologically, as part of our recovery from this crisis, that shores up deterrence in security terms abroad, but also leaves the door open to strategic cooperation with China where we have to. You can't deal with a pandemic or climate change or nonproliferation or any transnational threat without China at the table.
So dive in a little bit more about some of that competitiveness you would like to see domestically that we turn our attention towards to actually, strengthen our hand against or vis-a-vis China. Well, what does that look like in your opinion?
This is something that Americans are really good at. If they're given a challenge, we have a great history of rising to the occasion with the right leadership and investment. So for me, that looks like investing in science and technology, research and development, investing in our innovation ecosystem, the Silicon Valley's, Austin's, Route 128s of the United States. Investing in 21st century infrastructure. Why in the world are we not a world leader in 5G? We can be, but we need to invest. Smart immigration policy. So much of our strength is attracting the best talent in the world and then keeping it. Half of Silicon Valley founders are either immigrants or first-generation Americans. That's something we should continue. So there are smart domestic policies we can put in place as we recover that will help us emerge from this stronger if we play our cards right.
That's interesting. So you can put more of a focus on broadband instead of, roads necessarily. So when we're talking about these kinds of things.
Yes, indeed.
So when you look at, we obviously had a $2 trillion, I don't want to call it a stimulus, more like a relief package that came out. There's talk of a new package. What is not kind of, in your opinion, either being talked about or prioritized in terms of a response from Washington in terms of planning for a recovery?
I do think so far we're still in the relief phase. I think when you look at recovery, there are types of spending, if we really look at our supply chains, if we really look at some of these 21st century infrastructure issues, and some of what are the sectors where we want to be most competitive. I think there are ways that you can accelerate recovery in certain sectors to boost our chances of regaining some leadership there. And I don't think we've kind of gotten to that point yet, understandably, because we're still in the thick of this. But I think that's important. The truth is, though, this, I think it's $4 trillion that have been committed. I mean, we are going to be in a very deep economic hole. And, those holes are dug in a matter of weeks or months, but they take years and decades to recover from. I also think this crisis is going to create even greater awareness of some persistent inequalities in our country that are going to need to be addressed in policy coming out of this. So this is going to be it's not going to be a single administration that, balances the budget and gets us out of debt. This is going to be a long time in addressing.
Yeah. So in looking at the global landscape and leadership, what countries do you think have really risen to the occasion or responded to COVID-19 in terms of, a response and just hitting the ground running?
Actually, I don't know if you saw Mike Morrell and I, former CIA acting director, and I wrote a piece in the Washington Post over the weekend, basically asking this question. And we highlighted countries like South Korea, like Taiwan, like New Zealand, and that what they had in common were 6 things. 1, they had invested up front in robust public health systems. 2, the general health of their population was better in terms of pre-existing conditions that make the virus work. worse, like heart disease, diabetes, and obesity. Third, they had strong cultures of social cohesion. And so that they were able to pull together more effectively and were more compliant with the shutdown guidance and so
Sure.
forth. Fourth, they had governments that acted decisively and early. Fifth, they had, what was the fifth thing? National approaches rather than regional. So Germany, implemented a national shutdown. Italy started with a regional, and then the virus inadvertently spread. Then they had to go to national. And lastly, leadership. Those with leaders who were transparent, fact-based, frequent, consistent, empathetic in their communications had much better results, whether it was the Prime Minister of New Zealand or the president of South Korea, who just won a landslide re-election of his party as a result of his competent handling of the crisis.
Yeah, we had a previous coffee talk with Joe Stiglitz, and a lot of what he talked about was the kind of lacked in the trust space, right? Where we kind of have dismantled trust in government, in media, in science, right? And then when a crisis like this happens, how do we put ourselves in a position where we can't react or where people can't trust?
I worry about that right now, that you do not have an administration that's speaking consistently or one voice or coordinating with governors in terms of the reopening of the U.S. economy. If we mishandle this, you're going to have another wave of this virus and even greater costs. We have to remember, going back in history in 1918, when you had the flu pandemic, it was the second wave that was even more deadly than the first.
Interesting. When you take a step back and look at the Department of Defense and national security threats, I mean, we've talked in the past, obviously, like climate is now something that should be perceived as a national security threat, now health. How do you view threats against the United States? I mean, are these the new threats we should be worried about? Is it other countries? Is it cyber? What do you think we're most vulnerable to as a country?
The challenge is it's all of the above. I mean, it's not that there aren't priorities, there are, but someone recently asked me, well, shouldn't we just forget about the Middle East? Well, we could do that, but and I would argue that it should be should garner less attention than certainly it's gotten in the last 20 years. And relatively speaking, we need to be shifting more of our focus to China and cyber and other areas. But this is a risk management problem. You've got a portfolio of threats that that affect U.S. interests in different ways, to different degrees and different likelihoods. And we need an administration that has the expertise and sophistication and consistency to manage that well.
Yeah. And how do you think this has become kind of a partisan issue almost already, right? Instead of everyone kind of collectively, it seems like,
And leadership. We have not had a leader that's used. I mean, this could have been a tremendously unifying moment for the country. And I think, frankly, at the neighborhood and community level, it has been that. I mean, people are doing extraordinary acts of kindness are going on.
Yeah.
The appreciation of frontline health workers and first responders, the philanthropic donations, all of that is a wonderful testament to the character of this country. But it's not been helped by the fact of, the nature of the leadership we have currently in the White House, but also that, we're going into an election season. And when the president's party decides to put out their first big ad against Joe Biden, is portraying him as, as soft on China. I mean, that's very unfortunate in my view. That's not exactly the wrong tone that we should be setting right now for the country.
Yeah. So when you're in this incredible role right now, you started WestExec Advisors. Tell us a little bit about what kind of services your clients are most interested in right now. I mean, how has your day job changed in the last 8 weeks?
Yeah. Well, we are helping a number of global companies and financial institutions who have interests around the world to try to understand where this is heading, how, where's the virus going, what are the right metrics, what is reopening going to look like, what impacts will it have on trade, where are our relationships going? What is the White House going to do? What is the Congress going to do? What are foreign governments going to do?
Yeah.
We are living and breathing, COVID all the time, but really trying to get a little bit ahead of things to anticipate where this is going and where, where not only where the challenges are, but what is it going to mean in terms of opportunities for businesses in the future as well.
Yeah, like new sectors that are going to emerge and stuff.
New sectors, changes in supply chains, new markets, things that will become more important, things that will become less, and also what roles they can play as concerned global citizens. In trying to deal with
so these are obviously dire, unprecedented times. But with all these talks, we try to identify some type of silver lining, something to be optimistic or positive about. So as you look at these very important challenges ahead of us, what possibly could be a silver lining to emerge out of this?
Well, not to be too partisan here, but I think the silver lining is Americans want competence.
Yeah.
They want competence. They want a commander-in-chief whose values and whose, expressions, show empathy, show America as a force for good in the world, speak to our better angels, not our worst. I mean, I just think that this crisis has sort of drawn back the curtain on this president, and I think what people see is not what they want at a time like this. So my hope is we'll have a change.
Yeah, lots of rebuilding, it looks like, just in general. I mean, internally, globally, America's stature, and so on. So
absolutely. And I think the big note of optimism is we've gone through periods not quite like this, but times where America was counted out, and we've risen from the ashes of and come back even stronger. Whether it was Great Depression, World Wars, Cold War, etc. We've 9/11. We can come together as a nation and lead again and be better for it. But we need the right leadership in place to do that.
Well, that's incredible. Well, look, I promised you we would make sure you get out of here just in time for your next meeting. So I want to thank you for being here with us.
Thank you.
I want to thank everyone for tuning in as well. Our next coffee talk is going to be this Thursday, April 23rd at 10:30 a.m. We're going to talk about the future of flexible office space with the CEOs of Industrious, Convene, and Notel. In the words of Andrew Cuomo, stay home, stop the spread, and save lives.
Yeah. Hope everybody stays healthy and safe.
Yes, exactly. You as well. Talk soon, and thank you so much for being here.
Sure. Thank you.
Take care. Thanks, everyone.